We are going through the book of Judges. We've gotten as far as chapter 15. That's where we pick up tonight. This last few chapters, we've been looking at the life of Samson. And you know, what an interesting character in the Bible. A couple of things that kind of, stand out, because we're going to look at Samson's failures once again. I entitled the message, A Lesson Never Learned. And Samson was that guy that had every opportunity, and God was giving him chance after chance to get it right. And Samson is one of the biggest disappointments in all the Judges, and really, you kind of in all the Bible, there's one verse that kind of it just when you hear it, it just kind of, it's like disheartening. It's kind of like, it's sad, and we won't get it till chapter 16, but it says, and Samson did not know that the Lord had departed from him. You see, he thought that everything was going to be just like it always was, but there came a point where Samson crossed the line, and God could no longer be part of, no longer empower this man. Now, one of the things we see at the end of that is that Samson finally comes to his senses, and he cries out to the Lord, and God, again, amazingly, God again gives him the power of his spirit, and it was one last event. He defeats the Philistines, and more than he had ever did in his life, he did in his death. What a sad way to end a life, but at least Samson came to his senses before it was too late. So, it's one of those guys where we've been looking at his life, and we've been looking at, the beginnings of his life. If you go back to chapter 13, we were told already that Samson would be born, and his mom was unable to bear a child. She was barren. And what's incredible is that an angel shows up. The angel Lord shows up and tells Samson's mom, and then eventually Samson's dad, that you're going to have a child, and that child was to be a Nazirite from his birth. That means that he was to be set apart, that he wasn't to partake in anything, any wine. He wasn't to defile himself with a dead body. I mean, there were certain things that Samson was to avoid because of his calling that God had in his life. It tells us in the 13th chapter a little bit about his childhood and his upbringing. It says in chapter 13, verse 24, the woman bore a son, and they called his name Samson, and the child grew. Watch this. And the Lord blessed him, and the Spirit of the Lord began to move upon him in Mahana Dan, between Zorah and Eshtaol. And so, kind of the summary of Samson's early years. He grew up in a godly home. He grew up with a godly influence. Samson had the Spirit of God moving in him in those formative years of his life. By the time we get to chapter 14, Samson puts his eyes upon a Philistine woman, and he wants to marry her. He tells his dad, hey, Dad, that's the one. He goes, can't you find a woman amongst our own people, Samson? The whole idea is that they would be serving different gods if you're going and looking for a woman from the Philistines. She was already, involved with idolatry and involved with immorality, and that was the way of the Philistines. And Samson said, no, that's the one I want. And so Dad goes and negotiates the dowry. Now, the whole thing about a dowry in that day was you were literally paying alimony in advance. Think about that. Just kind of like, and just in case we ever divorce, I want enough money to take care of this, your wife, who will now come back into my house. And so they would make an agreement upon how much money they would pay ahead of time before he ever married, a woman. Now that's hopeful. When you're already making plans before it even starts, right? We're going to plan for divorce before we ever get married. But that's exactly what would happen in that culture. And what's incredible in the whole thing is that they go to the wedding, everything's going just as planned. There was a 7-day feast. Samson on the way up there had killed the lion the first time. The second time he gets honey out of the lion, and he goes and he poses a riddle to all of those that were in the wedding party. And there was a bet that was posed. If you figure out the riddle, then I'll give you each, all 30 of you, a set of clothes. But if you can't figure out the riddle, then every one of you give me a set of clothes. And so Samson's thinking, man, I'm going to have enough clothes for a lifetime. 30 changes of clothes. And that would have been a big deal. That would have been a great amount of money in that time. And so Samson goes thinking that he's got him duped, but his wife-to-be begins to prod him. Samson, if you love me, you'll tell me the riddle. Now, the reason she was asking for the riddle is because those that were in the wedding party had threatened her and her dad that if he takes our 30 pairs of clothes, then we're going to burn you. Nice guys. That's the kind of wedding party you're looking for. We'll burn you to death, right? If you don't find out what's going on. And so she's under threat of death, and she ends up, getting Samson to tell the riddle. And so as he tells the riddle, she tells it to the wedding party. They tell him the riddle, and then sure enough, Samson leaves furious. I mean, it's interesting that Samson, never consummates the wedding. And it seems as though God protected him up to this point. Even though God had done all of these things, you see, God was looking for an opportunity to move against the Philistines. We found that out in chapter 14 as well. But God was going to use Samson's weakness instead of Samson's strength to accomplish that. Now, it's where we pick up in chapter 15. That's why I gave you the whole background on this, because chapter 15, what's happening is that Samson had left upset, angry, because she had told the wedding party about his riddle. And so it tells us in chapter 15, after a while, in the time of the wheat harvest, it happened that Samson visited his wife with a young goat. And he said, let me go into my wife, into her room. But her father would not permit him to go in. Now, after some time that passes, it doesn't tell us how long. We know it was the wheat harvest time. We don't know when the wedding had taken place, but Samson was MIA for some time. He kind of decides, I'm going to go back, and I don't know, maybe lonely at home, thinking about, my wife is over there, and, I bet she still loves me. I'll go back and I'll just go consummate the wedding. I'll go make her my wife, for real kind of thing. And so all of a sudden Samson makes his journey. He comes with a peace offering. He comes with a goat. I mean, you want to make a woman happy, bring her a goat. That's was Samson's philosophy. He comes in with a goat. He's going to bring his little present, like bringing a bouquet of flowers, I guess. Just here, baby. Here's a goat. Hang out with that guy. You'll really. Look at verse 2. And her father said, I really thought that you were thoroughly hated her. Therefore I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister better than she? Please take her instead. He goes, look, I thought you were done with her. I thought you hated her. She, ratted you out. I thought you would never come back again. And so I gave her to the best man in the wedding. That's literally what's taking place. We were going to have a wedding that day with or without you, Samson. And it just happened that there was the best man and he was willing to take her. And I guess he came up with another dowry or something. And, I was making some money that week. And Samson is furious. Well, so much so, watch what it says. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them. And Samson went out and he caught 300 foxes And he took torches. He turned the fox's tail to tail and put torches between each pair of tails. And when he had set the torches on fire, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines. And he burned up both the shocks and the standing grain, as well as the vineyards and the olive groves. And the Philistines said, who has done this? Now, I mean, who comes up with a plot like that? He goes and he traps 400 foxes. Now, we don't know, what Samson was thinking at this point, but he just, he comes up with this great plan. We'll just get these foxes, I'll tie the foxes' tails together, I'll put a torch in the middle, and, I'll just let them run rampant all over the grain, all over the vineyards, all over the olive groves, and literally burns down. I mean, imagine how much damage. You got 150 pairs of foxes just running with torches tied to them, and they're, just burning down the house. That's exactly what Samson is doing. And you look at this whole picture, and there's something that you note in the life of Samson. Every time Samson is going to go against the Philistines, it's out of vengeance for himself. Every time he's going to try to defeat the Philistines, it's never for God or for the glory of God or because I'm doing what God's asked me to do. It's always because Samson's trying to get vengeance for something done against him. And I think that's Samson's weakness. That's Samson's fault. That's Samson's, problem that he continued to have, is that everything revolved around Samson. It was all about Samson. If someone messes with Samson, then there's going to be a payment to be made. And it was never because this is what God. Now God had raised up Samson. He had given him the power of his spirit so that he would defeat the Philistines. That was to be his task. That was to be his job. But it was never because that's what God had instructed me to do. It's because I'm going to take vengeance for what was done to me. And he goes and he burns down the whole place. Now, again, you look at this motivation of Samson, and I think you can see why Samson is in the state that he's in. Unlike King David. Remember King David, we'll get to him when we get to the book of 1 Samuel. In chapter 17, David is a little boy, and he comes walking up, and he sees Goliath out there, and Goliath is mocking the children of Israel, just like, send someone out, I'll kill him. And David's looking around going, how come no one's fighting this guy? He's mocking the living God. He is bringing a disgrace to the nation of Israel. And David says, let me at him. And they are all mocking, like, you're too little. You're like a little boy. What are you going to do against Goliath? He goes, you don't understand. He goes, I fought against lions and I've taken down bears, barehanded, because God was with me. And God can take this guy. I'm going to go in there for God's glory. And I love it because there's a conversation that takes place between Goliath and David in that battle. It's in 1 Samuel 17:44. It says, the Philistines said to David, come to me and I'll give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field. And David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you've defiled. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand, and I will strike you and take your head from you. And this day I will give the carcass of the camp of the Philistines to the birds of the air, to the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. Did you see the difference in the heart between David and Samson? You see, David's going to go to battle because God was the one who was going to empower him. Samson's going to battle because someone offended him. Because someone, didn't give him what he wanted. And so this was a fight against Samson and the Philistines. And when David was fighting, it was a fight against God and the Philistines. And there's a big difference between the two. Because if the only reason we're doing anything is because of our own pride or because of our own interest, then how does God get the glory in that? But if we're going to do something for God and His glory and for His kingdom, and we're doing it for Him and not for us, then He gets all the glory. Then it becomes all about God and not about me, and not about my agenda or my wants. And Samson was the epitome of self-centeredness when it came to doing God's business. And we see the results of it. Now, watch what happens is verse 6, it says, and the Philistines said, who's done this? And they answered, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he's taken his wife and given her to his companion. So the Philistines came up and they burned her and her father with fire. Nice guys. Literally burned them alive. And what's interesting is that Samson, now is seeing the consequences of his own actions taken out on even though no matter how angry he was with his father-in-law and with his wife, he had no desire for that kind of result, or that kind of payment to be made for them. And Samson gets upset again. Look at verse 7. And Samson said to them, since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after this I will cease. So he attacked them hip and thigh with a great slaughter, and he went down and he dwelt in the cleft of the rock of Edom. Samson, what was his motivating factor? Revenge. Again, you did that, now I'll do this. And it was always this idea that you're gonna get what's coming to you. I'm gonna take vengeance on what you've done, rather than asking God. And you know what's incredible, guys? Up until this point, this far in the life of Samson, and not once have we seen Samson pray. Not once has Samson cried out to God for direction or for wisdom or for help or for any insight to anything. Samson, up to this point, is letting his own feelings dictate his actions. What a sad state. This isn't some heathen, guys. This is a man who grew up in a home where God was the center. This is a man where it says that the Spirit of God was with him and upon him on multiple occasions in his life. And yet it's his feelings that are dictating his actions rather than God dictating his actions. And I think there's a lesson for all of us here. I don't think Samson's alone in this. I think you and I can fall into the same trap where we're allowing our emotions or our feelings to make the decisions for us rather than allowing God in His Word, God in His instructions to give us direction. I think God wanted to do greater things than Samson ever accomplished in his life. I think God had greater plans for Samson that never were fulfilled, because Samson was basing everything on what he wanted rather than what God wanted for him. Now, watch the next. I mean, it gets even more interesting. Verse 9. And it says this. Now the Philistines went up, and they encamped in Judah, and they deployed themselves against Lehi. And the men of Judah said, why have you come up against us? And they answered, we have come up to arrest Samson, to do to him as he's done to us. You see the pattern here? Samson is acting like the Philistines. These were the unbelievers. They did to me what, they got what deserved. Now we're going to give Samson what he deserves. And this was all about going back and forth about who deserved what, rather than what does God say in this situation. And so he, just like the Philistines, he says, you know what, Samson did this to us. Now we're going to do it to him. It's what he deserves. And then watch what happens. He says that then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom, and they said to Samson, do you not know that the Philistines rule over us? What is this you've done to us? And he said to them, as they did it to me, so I did it to them. That seemed to be his motto in life. As they did it to me, so I did it to them. I thought there was another interesting thought here. Think about this, guys. At the end of the chapter, we're going to find out that Samson ruled or was a judge in Israel for 20 years. See, a judge in Israel was the deliverer. He was the guy that was looked to set course and direction. He was a leader. Now he's got 3,000 of his own men coming to arrest him and hand him over to the Philistines. And I think somewhere along the line, Samson didn't have the respect of his own people. They didn't see him as their leader because Samson was all about Samson. And so they didn't look to him as that judge that they should have looked to him for. He wasn't the leader. It wasn't like, hey, they're coming against Samson. He's our leader. Let's get behind Samson and fight against Samson. You know what their decision was? Let's go arrest Samson. We'll extradite him to the Philistines. We'll tie him up. And they would rather fight against Samson than fight against the Philistines. Well, what a sad state of leadership that Samson had displayed. You know, when you're, and it's what's interesting is that Samson was winning his battles. Samson was defeating the Philistines. Every time he went up against them, he would wipe them out. He killed 30 to get their clothes. He wiped out a whole mess of other ones, as he was angry with the father-in-law for giving away his wife. When they burned her, he went out and wiped them out again. I mean, this is a guy who had God's power on his side. And yet he didn't have anyone that was willing to follow him because Samson was all about Samson. That's the opposite of leadership when it comes to what Jesus taught. Remember what Jesus is? You want to be great? Become the servant of all. You want to be first? Become last. Because when you're the one who's serving, then you're gonna see others will catch that vision and they'll get behind what you're doing. You see, the kingdom of heaven works in opposite than the kingdom of this world. And Samson never learned those lessons. He didn't learn the lessons here, and he doesn't learn the lessons until the end of his life. That God was looking for servants. God was looking for those to be the least. He was looking for those that are willing to be last so that he can elevate them to a place where he could use them. Not about them, about him. And this whole chapter, man, it just keeps reiterating the same idea that Samson had lost his influence. He had lost his direction. And notice how this goes down. Look at verse 14. Actually, a little bit further. I just go down to verse 12. And they said to him, "We have come down to arrest you, that we may deliver you into the hand of the Philistines." And Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves." And they spoke to him, saying, "No, but we will tie you securely, we'll deliver you into their hand, but we will surely not kill you." And they bound him with 2 new ropes, and they brought him up from the rock. And when he had come to Lehi, or Lehi is how that's pronounced, the Philistines came shouting against him. Check this out. And the Spirit of the Lord came mightily upon him, and the ropes that were on his arm became like flax, and it burned with fire, and his bonds broke loose from his hands. He found a fresh jawbone of a donkey. He reached out his hand, and he took it, and he killed 1,000 men with it. And Samson said, with the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. And so it was, when he had finished speaking, that he threw the jawbone from his hand, and he called that place Ramath Lehi. Now, in the middle of all of this, Samson comes in. You know, think about it. He's tied up. He's bound. And as he's being taken to the Philistines are shouting, we finally got Samson. You know, he's caused so much damage. He's caused so much problems. You know, once we've got Samson down, then, you know, we can wipe out all of these Jews. And, you know, they were already in a frenzy. And then all of a sudden it says that the Spirit of the Lord came upon Samson again. Guys, here's, and I think there's an incredible lesson here, is that God uses flawed men and women. God uses what you and I sometimes would see as unusable. You know, up to this point, you look at Samson's life and you go, man, why would God even want this guy around? I mean, everything he does is selfish. Everything he does is self-centered. Everything he does is an ego trip. I mean, Samson's that guy. And yet God continues to pour His Spirit. And I believe it's this because God was once again giving Samson another chance. Another chance to repent. Another chance to surrender. Another chance to say, God, I can't do this anymore. In my own power, in my own mind. And Samson, once again, he goes and, you know, takes the jawbone of I think that the scripture is very, very clear. It was a fresh jawbone of a donkey. It wasn't a stale jawbone of a donkey. Now, I think it tells that because, you know, a fresh jawbone had a little bit of strength to it. You get an old skeleton of something and it just cracks real easy. This jawbone was nice and fresh. And he just, uses that jawbone to kill 1,000 Philistines that day. And the Spirit of God once again comes upon Samson. And I believe that Samson thought that somehow by God's providence that he was the exception to the rule. I think I shared with you guys last week that I think the greatest mistake that Samson made is that he thought God's grace was somehow God's approval. That God somehow was overlooking all of Samson's selfishness and all of Samson's, self-centeredness, rather than, acknowledging all this time God's trying to get his attention so that he would be a broken man, a changed man. And that never happened for Samson. Not until both of his eyes are plucked out and he's walking around being the entertainment for the Philistines. Never realizing that it wasn't his power, it wasn't his might that was accomplishing these tasks. It was God and God's power and God's might that was accomplishing these things. God didn't need a Samson. God could have used the donkey to do everything. Right? God doesn't need us, guys. He doesn't need me, and He doesn't need you. God can accomplish His purposes without us. But He allows us to be part of what He's doing. As long as we're going to be those that are acknowledging, God, this is you, not me. Samson doesn't acknowledge that. Ever. He thinks it's something that he did or something that he's gifted with, rather than acknowledging that this was all a God thing. And I'm convinced of that because of the next verse. Check this out. Look at the next verse. And so it was, When he had finished speaking, he threw the jawbone from his hand. He called the name of the place Ramath Lehi. And he became very thirsty. So he cried out to the Lord. And he said, you have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant. And now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised? So God split the hollow place that is in Lehi, and water came out, and he drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. And here's what I'm convinced of. That at the end of this battle, Samson had to come to the reality of his own humanity. He had to come to the reality that unless God delivered water into his hands, that he was going to die, and the uncircumcised Philistines would come and carry him away. He became so thirsty. I don't know if you've ever been that thirsty in your life, or you just like, if I don't get a drink now, I don't know if I'm going to make it. And Samson came to the point where he realized that unless I get some water, I'm a dead man. And he's in the middle of an area where there's nothing around and there's no water available. And it says that God at that moment splits the hollow rock, and out of it comes forth the water. And once again, Samson sees a miracle. A miracle. And I think all of it was so that Samson would understand his own weakness. That Samson would come to this place where he realized, I'm dependent upon God. If anything good is going to happen, if any great victory is ever going to take place, if there's ever going to be anything that's going to be for God and for his glory, it's because God did it, not me. I think the Apostle Paul in the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 2, he came to that conclusion. Now think about this. Paul the Apostle was the most educated of all of the apostles. He was a Pharisee. He was educated under one of the great rabbis of their day. He had excelled in every aspect of Judaism. If anybody was somebody in that world, it was Paul the Apostle. He was given the name Saul of Tarsus. And God changed his name to Paul. And Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 2, in the first verse, this is what Paul declares. He says, and I, brethren, when I came to you, did not come to you with excellence of speech or of wisdom, declaring to you the testimony of God, but I determined not to know anything among you except Jesus Christ and him crucified. I was with you in weakness, in fear, and in much trembling, and my speech and my preaching were not with persuasive words of human wisdom, but in the demonstration of the Spirit and of power, that your faith should not be in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. I'm convinced that Paul was the great orator. Paul was the guy who could have dazzled him with his knowledge and his wisdom. But he says, I made a determination. I determined that I wasn't going to come to you in the wisdom of man, but I was going to come to you in the power of the Spirit. It wasn't going to be something that you're going, ooh, look at Paul. They were going to go, that guy, all he had was Jesus. That was all that he had to offer. It wasn't his great abilities or his great skills or his great sermons that he was able to put together. It was going to be that there's something working in the life of Paul that is able to transform lives. It was the power of God. And it's the power of God that transforms lives. It has nothing to do with the man. It has everything to do with the Spirit. It has everything to do with you and I becoming the vessels that God's Spirit can work through. It's about realizing that you know what, it's not about wisdom that I possess. It's about what God is able to accomplish with a vessel that's surrendered to Him. It's when we're weak that he's strong. It's when at the end of ourself that God can show his glory, his power, his might. It was in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, in the fourth verse, and I love this. There's Jesus is talking, and Jesus is talking about the vine dresser, that he's the Father is the vine dresser, and he says, and he's the vine, and he says in chapter 15, verse 4, he says, "Abide in me, and I in you, as the branch cannot bear fruit of itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me." Watch what he says. "For I am the vine and you are the branches. He who abides in me and I in him bears much fruit, for without me you can do nothing." I mean, Jesus said it's as clear as day. He says, look, unless you're abiding in me, unless you're connected to me, unless your substance is coming from me, you can't do anything. This isn't about you. This is about me. All you got to do is hold on to me and I'll do it. And Samson had it backwards. You see, Samson thought that it was by his might and by his will and his agenda and his desires and his feelings that everything was going to be accomplished. And Samson had to learn. Or at least God was trying to teach him. He never learned. That it wasn't about you, Samson. It's about me. And guys, I think it's the greatest lesson that you can ever learn. It's the greatest lesson I can ever learn. This isn't about you. This isn't about what you can accomplish or what you can do. This is simply about you learning that I can do nothing without Christ doing it. I have nothing to offer. Paul in the 12th chapter of 2 Corinthians, in verse 9, he says, as he was talking to the Lord and he was asking God to take away some thorn that he was going through, something that was ailing him. He says, and God said to him, "My grace is sufficient for you, for my strength is made perfect in weakness." My strength is made perfect in weakness. It's when you come to this realization that, God, I can't do it, that then God can do it. Samson was there with no water, and for the first time in 3 chapters, Samson prays. And it was one of those, another selfish prayer. If you really look at the prayer, it was like, "Lord, if you don't give me water, I'm going to die. And then the uncircumcised Philistines are going to carry me off." It was all about Samson. It wasn't about the Lord. Lord, they're going to be, it's going to be disgrace to you. It wasn't. Samson didn't even care. All that Samson can worry about was what it was going to look like for Samson. But God being so gracious, he says, so God split the hollow place that's in Lehi. Water came out. Samson drank, and his spirit returned, and he revived. Samson, I'm sure just chugging the water, and then all of a sudden he kind of comes back to his senses again. Kind of just comes back and says, "Wow, I'm going to live through this. I'm going to be okay." And then it says, therefore he called the name of the name in Hakor, which is in Lehi, to this day. And he judged Israel for 20 years in the days of the Philistines. Now you would think after an experience like that Samson would have been like, all right, I'm weak, God's strong. Not my desire, not my will, not my passions, not my. You get to chapter 16, and we're just going to look at the first couple of verses because I think it almost leaves us hanging if you don't. But look at it says, now Samson went to Gaza. He saw a harlot there, and he went into her. And the Gazites were told, Samson has come here. And they surrounded the place, and they lay in wait for him all night at the gate of the city. And they were quiet all night, saying, in the morning when it is daylight, we will kill him. And Samson laid low till midnight, and he arose at midnight, took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two gateposts. He pulled them up, bar and all, and he put them on his shoulders, and he carried them to the top of the hill that faces Hebron. Guys, he puts himself in another compromising position, thinking that he's going to get away with it again. He goes in, and guys, this is the judge. This is the guy, when you go and read Hebrews chapter 11, his name is listed as a man of faith. If you're just reading chapter 13, 14, 15, and 16 in the book of Judges, you would never come to that conclusion. It's kind of one of those things you got to go back and, but really? Samson's in here? You got to be kidding me. You see that guy? He had a problem. He had a woman problem. And all he did was, from one desire to the next desire. The next chick that got his eye, he was running after that one. And here's Samson, and he goes down to Gaza, and he finds a harlot. And he has relations with this harlot. And God delivers them out of that trap. Again. And what you find out is, as we don't have time to get to the rest of the chapter. The rest of it's good. We get into the story of Delilah next. If you haven't read Delilah, that's quite an entertaining story. I think you can do a couple movies out of just Delilah. But what's sad is that Samson never learned the lesson. Never. He never realized that he was pushing the limits further and further and further. And there comes a point where God says, okay, man, you crossed the line. I've given you grace after grace and chance after chance. And now you've literally have despised the grace that I've given you. You see, I can relate to Samson because God had given me chance after chance after chance. I remember on a few occasions, I had surrendered my life. God, whatever you want, I want to live my life for you from here on. And you just kind of just go back right to your old life. And God would give me, that one another opportunity. I remember one night, man, I was getting high. I was doing a lot of coke that night. And I remember my heart was about to pound out of my chest. I had taken one hit too many. And I thought I was going to die. I thought for sure, man, I'm gone. I'm going to die tonight. I'm going to die. I'm going to go to hell because I know the truth. And I never surrendered to that truth. And I remember crying out, God, if you just save me this one time, I give. I'll follow you. This is it. And it was like from 1 second to the next second, I was sober. My heart wasn't racing. I felt God's presence right there. And I was like, man, God, that's it. I remember crying out, praying that night. And it wasn't a week later that I found myself in the very same position. And then once again, God, if you'll save me this time, I mean it. You ever done that? This time, God, I'm for real. And God being so gracious, again, spares me. At some point, by the grace of God, I learned the lesson. God, I give, I surrender. And that might be where you're at tonight, man. God's been giving you chance after chance. He's shown you grace after grace. And he's been trying to get your heart. He's trying to get your attention. And just like Samson, just like our nature, we let our feelings dictate. Anything that comes along and says, you know what, instead of falling after the Lord, why don't you fall after him or her or this or that or career and it's so easy for us to put our desires and our wants and our feelings and everything that we want in front of what God wants. Knowing that God has a plan for you, that he loves you. Knowing that God wants to accomplish his purposes in your life. And I think Samson becomes a great reminder for all of us that God doesn't give up. But there does come a point where there's a line where God says, okay, that's what you want. If that's the life you want to live, I'll let you. And he'll give you over to your lust, to your want, to your desire. And we don't realize that the wages of sin is death. And that's what we pay. That's what Samson had to pay.